And welcome to the Off the Charts podcast for the final week of the 2021 NFL regular season. I'm Mark Simon, along with SAS VP of Football Matt Minicherian.
What's up, Mark?
And lead football analyst Alex Fagerman.
Shalom.
We've spent a lot of time this year talking about team performance in terms of total points and the total points leaderboard, the stat you hear us throw out regularly. But as we head into the playoffs, we wanted to look at not just performance over the course of the year, but also how teams are trending in terms of their performance in various phases of the game. And you can think of this, if you've seen on Twitter or read articles on our blog, somewhat similar to what we do for what we call the world's number one quarterback rankings, where we take recency into account to get a better sense of how, in that case, a player, in this case, a team, is performing over time in pass defense or rushing efficiency. So it's a way of taking something else that we do and essentially transferring it over to here. We're going to go through some teams here. We'll go through the top teams first. Let's start with the Chiefs.
Yeah, so just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about in terms of the methodology here, what I started with was our points above average metric, which is basically the statistical underpinning of total points where everything's centered at 0. And I take that and basically weight it according to which week of the season we're in. So in week 17, it counts 17 units worth. In week 8, it counts 8 units worth. In week 1, it counts 1 unit worth. And you calculate that weighted average, and you get sort of a recency weighted metric of this points above average. It's also weighting for sample size. So in the example of like the Patriots who have 3 passing attempts in the game, that performance is going to be weighted less than a performance in which someone was average over 50 pass attempts, for example. So let's talk about the Chiefs here. We talked about the Chiefs obviously a lot this year. And to be honest, there's not that much new to say. The offense was never really quite as bad as it appeared, and our numbers reflect that. Several points above average in the passing game. Also, a few points above average in the pass defense game. The defense has really improved quite a bit. Through the first half, they were in the bottom 5 in EPA per play allowed in the passing game. They're in the top 10 since then. In the running game, they've gone from second worst to middle of the pack. So again, not necessarily so much about becoming an awesome defense, but going from being quite poor to perfectly serviceable for a Super Bowl caliber team. So this is now sort of the complete team that is every bit the threat that we thought they would be.
Alex, in terms of, you gave the whole methodology before, which was basically saying you made this system that tells you not just total points over the course of the year, but kind of weighted for more recent games to matter more based on that. What sort of rankings do they have on the different sides of the ball? Are there like bottom line numbers for that?
Yeah. So the Chiefs end up being 3rd ranked in the NFL in both passing and pass defense. They're 11th in running the ball and 7th in run defense. So pretty solid across the board, obviously better in the passing game on both sides of the ball.
That's really interesting because run defense, when you look at them over the course of the season, they're 25th, according to the most recent total point stat pack. So that recent performance has really, really changed, which obviously matches the eye test. The beginning of the season, I said I thought it was going to take a while for the Chiefs to gel. To your point, it didn't really take time for them to gel offensively. Maybe it appeared that way. It was the defense that was atrocious and took time to gel.
Yeah, the offensive line was obviously a huge concern for them to start the year, and that really didn't materialize as a problem as we expected it. The run defense, for what it's worth, if I took sort of an unweighted approach where I'm not weighting recency higher, they end up 23rd in run defense. So It really reflects that they've just improved quite a bit in that regard.
So we're noting improvement. Is there a cause to that?
I think that the defense really gelled together. It's easy to say, it bothered me because I heard Rex Ryan on TV saying like, Chris Jones should have always been playing defensive tackle the entire year. And I think that's crap for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think Spags cross-trained him to be able to play on the outside a bit. Number two, I still think he's having some snaps outside when you see that as well. So it's not like they're not using this in their scheme. I do think he's obviously better suited to be playing inside there more often. But I think that those growing pains that we saw early in the year might be part of the reason why right now we're not talking about a Chiefs defense that's kind of like just skating by. We're talking about a Chiefs defense that's been pretty damn good. So I don't think we can really hold it against him that he did that experiment if it, over the course of 18 games, got them to the place where they're doing things a little bit better.
In the passing game, we're seeing a little bit less of the back of Daniel Sorensen's jersey. Although, Jamar Chase's blowout game last week aside, that
was unfair.
Yeah, exactly.
So this was a case of the Chiefs figuring out what they were, basically, right, Matt?
I think that's fair to say. I think that What I would say is they got it together quicker than we expected on offense, when we expected some gelling with the offensive line there. But it took a while for them to really find what they are on defense. And yeah, they seem to have mostly figured that out, except when Jamar Chase is mossing them.
Let's move to the Pats. Alex, what do you got on New England and where they stand as they've moved along here with Mac Jones?
In terms of the recency weighted metric here, they end up being, as you might expect, pretty solid in the running game, 4th overall, actually better than you might expect, 6th in the passing game. And both pass defense and run defense end up being 16th ranked, which I think is a little bit inconsistent with how we think of that team in terms of being like a running game and defense type squad. The passing game is really still all right. And despite Mac Jones's Rookie of the Year campaign taking a little bit of a hit over the last few weeks, obviously there was a game in which he had 3 pass attempts. Starting with that game, if you include that game, the Pats are still in the top 10 in passing EPA. They're in the top 10 in positive play percentage. And they even have, if we're comparing to the Chiefs, like they have virtually the same boom and bust profile in the passing game as the Chiefs. So they've been pretty good with the passing game recently. And the defense has been fine, but it's been slipping a bit. Both the pass and rush defense rank middle of the pack. And we talk a lot, certainly Matt talks a lot about complementary football. And I think that the way that offense is built makes it so that the defense is given a little bit of an easier job, holding the ball for a lot, reducing the time in the game, being fairly consistent offensively makes it a little bit easier for the defense.
Yeah, the Patriots are a kind of interesting dichotomy. In one sense, there's a lot of like what we know about them showing through in these numbers. They are a team that wants to find as many ways to not lose games as possible. And they're really good at not losing games, not having any real big weaknesses that can be exploited and putting the onus on you to figure out a way to win the game because they're not about to lose it. At the same time, like you said, the passing game being ranked that high is pretty surprising. Over the course of the full year, we had them at 12th. And you said they were how high when you do the weighted rankings?
In the passing game, 6th.
That's really good. So that shows that they've really been coming on kind of offensively there in a way that I don't know if I've fully realized.
Yeah, I will say that volume does enter into it when we're trying to do these things. I'm trying to account for situations like when Mac Jones throws the ball 3 times versus somebody else throwing it 70 times. I'm trying to account for that a little bit by weighting by the amount of volume you have, but this is an above average metric. So if you're average for a relatively low number of pass attempts, that's going to look pretty good here. So that is part of it.
He's not being used a ton, but he's been efficient when he's been used.
Is this the best planning staff, coaching staff, offensive in the NFL? Is that what the key is here?
I mean, it's really easy to make the case that the Patriots are good at coaching football. Bill Belichick.
I'm looking. I want to go a step beyond that. Like, is this top of the? This is for this particular season. Again, doesn't matter if you have Tom Brady. It doesn't matter if it's Mac Jones, whoever. Is this like I was going to say an Academy Award-winning performance by their coaching staff?
I want to say that, like, Mac Jones, I understand that he went last among the 5 big quarterbacks this year, but he was like a top rookie quarterback coming out of the draft. And this isn't like, the Eagles taking Nick Foles and turning him into something. Like, this is a guy who has pedigree and had excellent performance in college, and we might be underselling him from a talent perspective by saying like this is the best coaching job we've ever seen. And I understand that that's not necessarily what you're saying, but we do need to keep in mind that this is a quarterback that has a level of talent that we'd expect him to have a pretty good pro performance. We expected him to be pretty good coming out of college, and this is sort of they've built a team that has been working with him.
I think they've been good, Mark. You could throw some other kind of like top 10 offensively teams this year in terms of efficiency that maybe you wouldn't have thought at the beginning of the year. The Eagles, the Bengals, the Cardinals, I think have all done really interesting things. And then I think you've got to mention the Colts just coming in with all the uncertainty around Carson Wentz, the way that they've crafted their stuff. So I think there's a few good options for teams that have done especially well in terms of their offense. And there are some options for the teams that have done especially poorly. There's a kind of crowded group at the bottom of the league in terms of who's had the worst assigned offense.
You mentioned the Bengals a second ago, and let's transition over to them. Joe Burrow, start of the season, was the number 22 quarterback in our world's number 1 quarterback rankings. In the last couple of weeks, he's moved up big time. He's now in the top 10, going from 14th to 10th last week to this week. After multiple monster games, where are the Bengals at this point?
Well, unsurprisingly, when you're waiting for recency, the Bengals end up being the number one passing game. Problem for them is that they rank in the 20s and everything else. So you wonder, they're really an example of a team that can test these sort of soft ideas of like teams getting hot at the right time, teams being driven by the passing game, all these sorts of things. They're going to be a good example of that. They have had a couple standout players on the defensive side. Trey Hendrickson and Sam Hubbard have both been really productive for them up front as pass rushers, although it's been more from making like splash plays than generating consistent pressure, which we know the pressure thing is going to be more reliable game over game. In fact, one of the plays that both of them were involved with was one where I was on the podcast a few weeks ago talking about how total points works. And that's basically a sack from one of those guys and then a recovery and return from the other. So that's sort of an example of the kinds of plays they've been making. Chidobe Awuzie has been one of the more targeted corners in the NFL, but he's been better at limiting damage from those targets than basically everyone who's in the top 20 in terms of most targets. So there are definitely
your chutzpah pronouncing that name. I like that.
Yeah, I will admit to have looked it up. So there are some impact players to watch out for defensively, but on the whole, not necessarily a group that we're particularly excited about. So they're definitely one of those teams that's going to some extent, live and die by the passing game.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Alex. This has been a team that, our recently departed colleague, Bryce Rossler, he's still alive, just not with SIS anymore. He's been kind of out on the Bengals all year. I think we've got to give him credit for what they've done. You got to give Joe Burrow credit. But I do think that when you look at a team that's bad blocking, they still really don't have any answers against a good pass rush other than get the ball out real quick. And they're really not impressive defensively. I think that when you go from the sort of COVID schedule that they've been rolling through with their passing game, just being unstoppable, into facing against some of these playoff defenses, I think they could win a game. But I don't see more than that unless Joe Burrow just really, turns it on and shows that he's that guy.
And what about the Titans?
The Titans are so. Again, talking about sort of times where I was on the show a few weeks ago, the Titans are the kind of team that it's hard to judge because of all of the uncertainty that they have in terms of injury status with, Derrick Henry coming back and we're not really sure what he's going to look like. But the team has been, obviously they're in a position to get a number one seed despite all that. And they end up being ranked in the, 19-20 range in both offensive dimensions and in the 9-10 range on the defensive side. So the defense has really picked them up over the last few weeks. And the running game, while it has looked pretty good in terms of total numbers and stuff like that, from an efficiency perspective, not great. And we know that even when Henry was going awesome, his efficiency wasn't so great. So it's been more about not necessarily having the big explosive plays in the passing game that come off of play action and that sort of thing, and maybe getting a little bit more explosion with Henry back in the lineup, both in terms of big plays in the running game, but also big plays in the passing game. That'll help them in the playoffs, if not necessarily right at this moment.
Yeah, I mean, this is a team I had kind of left them for dead, but here they are all of a sudden. They managed to win enough games early and bear through and get some of these wins to the point where they're in a great position heading into the playoffs. They got Derrick Henry coming back, and Ryan Tannehill, who's been a shell of himself. This will be the team with the worst quarterback performance this season that makes the playoffs, regardless of who makes the playoffs with the rest of the seeds. And at the same time, with Derrick Henry back in the lineup, all of a sudden we might be able to see that increase in performance from Tannehill that we've kind of come to expect in his time with the Titans there. A.J. Brown is scary offensively. They're a tough offensive team where even with Henry out, they've been just committed to the run game. And give some credit to their defensive front. Their defensive front absolutely transformed their defense this year. And they've been as tough a defense as any. Alex, you said they were pretty top in both pass defense and rush defense in the weighted statistics.
Yeah, 9th in pass defense, 10th in run defense.
Interesting. That's probably lower than I would have expected. Overall, though, I just don't think this team is as good as a lot of the other teams that they're going to have to compete with. I still so I give them all the credit in the world for getting where they got. We'll see if having Derrick Henry back can help Ryan Tannehill get them to the point where they're really competitive in the AFC versus more kind of what I expect, where they're kind of in that second tier Bengals category for me.
And one other top tier team, the Bills.
Yeah, so this is one of the more surprising results with this methodology that is kind of quirky. So they're 9th in terms of recency weighted passing performance. They're 10th on the defensive side in the passing game. They are 2nd in the running game. and 22nd in run defense. That second in the running game should surprise a lot of people considering that they don't really run that often. But remember, this is an above average metric. I do some amount of weighting based on sample size. So I am going to, if you're 2 points above average with only 2 carries, that's going to matter a lot less than if you had 40 carries. But to be honest, like in recent days, even excluding the quarterback running side of things, they're number 1 in broken and missed tackle rate per attempt over the second half of the season. Only a few teams have gotten stuffed less frequently in the running game, again, excluding quarterback runs. So, and then you can add in the Josh Allen effect. So they've been pretty effective in the running game in ways that aren't necessarily as obvious, just sort of being on schedule, being able to break those tackles in the backfield, that sort of thing. To me, the point of concern is going to be the pass defense. Their ranking with the recency weighted for pass defense is 10th. They were 3rd if you do the full season version. And that's Tre'Davious White getting hurt. That's reductions in performance elsewhere. They've really only had one excellent game in terms of pass defense over the last couple months. And that range of weeks started before White got hurt. So, through week 10, White, Jordan Poyer, Levi Wallace, Taron Johnson were all in the top 25 defensive backs in pass coverage points saved. None of those guys can say that in the week since. So to me, that's the biggest concern, especially when you're facing teams like the Chiefs, who are going to put it up offensively, the Bengals as well. That would be my biggest concern for them.
Yeah, you're right. That's super. Like the Bills defense was just crushing people early in the year, like 2 shutouts in their first 4 games or something like that. It makes sense. They're kind of a middle of the pack when you look over the course of the year. And then when you look at more recently weighted, it's like, oh, wait, actually not so great. And then the rushing stuff's totally surprising too. Obviously, like you're saying, they're not having a lot of running back carries compared to a lot of teams. But when they've chosen to run the ball, they've actually been pretty efficient in that regard, especially considering that they've been a bad blocking team, which is what I come back to, because for years I said, I thought Josh Allen was the guy that was holding this team back. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think that the defense can be a great defense. I think that the offense has all of the weapons that they need, and it comes down to the offensive line really not performing great this year. For me, that's the unit that I question the most going forward. We'll see what they have going into the postseason against those other top tier teams, like you said. I think they're definitely a contender when they're kind of hitting on all cylinders.
So let's rank by those numbers, Alex, these teams that you've brought up from top to bottom in terms of with the recency being the important part of the statistic.
Yeah, so we end up with the Chiefs at the top. They end up being sort of the number 1 team overall in the NFL as a consequence of being sort of top 10 across the board.
That's pretty interesting because they're number 3 on the full season ranking. So when you recency weight it, they go arrow up.
Yeah, the defensive improvement definitely makes a difference, and even just we understand that the Chiefs' offense was never quite as bad as it looked in the middle of the season, but doing that recency weighting, obviously with the most recent performances being pretty good, that definitely gives them a little bit of a bonus, even in the running game. Next up would be the Bills, 4th in the NFL overall. That run defense, ranking 22nd, not necessarily hampering them. We're going to talk about that a little bit more when we talk about, teams on the NFC side as well. Pats just behind them at 5th in the NFL. And the Bengals at 9th. So all these teams are, definitely solidly contenders in terms of recency weighted points above average. Then we get to, the Colts at 14th, the Titans at 16th. And that's where you get the teams that are more borderline. And obviously the Titans being 16th and being a potential number 1 seed, like that's pretty notable. But we understand that there have been some injuries and stuff where we expect them to be slightly better going into the playoffs than they have shown over the last month or 2.
Okay, so you mentioned the Colts as middle of the pack right there with the Titans, and I want to go a little more in depth on them. Their scenario this week isn't particularly complicated. Win at Jacksonville and make the playoffs. What do the total points trends say about the Colts?
Yeah, so we know the story with the Colts. They look a lot like, honestly, the Titans of recent vintage, being really reliant on the running game and middle of the road elsewhere. They are, the best. They are the best running game, recency weighted. They're the best running game overall, but they're 13th in passing, 22nd in pass defense, 18th in run defense. So definitely just sort of fine and workable in the other dimensions. Best running game, I think it's worth noting, like the best running game from this metric is about as much above average in terms of points per game as like the 5th to 8th best passing game. So, you can be really good in running or really good in run defense, but like the scale of that is not the same as being really good in passing or pass defense. And that's why they're in the position they're in. They've gotten a smidge better defending the pass and a smidge worse defending the run over the course of the year. And that'll work out all right, considering as long as they're not facing the sort of like Patriots style matchup in the playoffs. So they're being ranked where they are is consistent with where the position they're in heading into the playoffs. They still have to win to get in, but they're not necessarily a top tier contender.
Yeah, one thing I noticed, you're looking at the full season leaderboard, is that the Broncos are surprisingly high. They're right there with the Colts. How does that reflect on the recency sort of scale? I feel like the Broncos had a fast start and then looked like they were awful for a while. And now to see them sneaking into the top 10 in total points, I'm curious about that.
Yeah, the recency weighting doesn't quite like them as much. It's a lot. And again, part of it is that the Broncos have been relatively efficient in dimensions that don't necessarily provide as much value in total, being in the top 12 in both running game and run defense with the recency weighting, whereas they're more like 18th to 22nd in passing and pass defense.
Interesting. So that sounds more in line with what I would have expected. It's interesting that the full season numbers come out that way.
Yeah, and part of it, I guess, is the full season stuff that you're looking at is also per play. So there again are some sort of like there's some volume stuff that comes into play where if you're particularly good at certain dimensions that aren't actually coming up that often, that can also affect things.
So before we move on to look at the NFC teams, we typically do a mid-show commercial, and we want to use this one to do a salute to the people that are kind of the engine behind what we do, the video scouts who do all the tracking of games. And we have a very comprehensive video scout system here where much more than one person, one watch of a game, and the amount of time that is spent tracking every little detail that allows us to talk about things like this in this level of detail. Matt, you're kind of the head of this. Explain the value of the video scouts to our organization.
I mean, what our video scouts do and what our entire operations team does is absolutely the backbone of everything that we do here at SIS, everything that we do in terms of helping teams, everything that we do in terms of what we're able to share publicly, and everything that we're able to research and learn for ourselves, which is, a big part of why we're here. I don't know if you can tell, but Alex is an intrinsically motivated fellow, and as we all are around here. So what the scouts do is, and the operations staff sets up a system where each game is viewed by at least 4 different scouts just on the initial data passes, so that we have multiple views of every sort of data point and angle that we're looking at on all these plays. And it's incredibly intricate, covering all the sort of data points that you would see from quality control type coaches, like what are the routes and coverage schemes that are happening on each play, the blocking schemes, etc. And then on top of that, some of the advanced stats that we track and some of the really interesting, cool stuff on top of that, like our injury tracking with John Veros and his team and everything that goes beyond that. So the video scouts are absolutely integral to everything that we do. The actual charting of the football games is where all the data comes from, in addition to what we do to supplement that with different, technological things. And then for what they did, making it through the pandemic, I guess we're still going through the pandemic, I just couldn't be more humbled by everything that all of our video scouts have done. So huge shout out to all of the video scouts. We'll be hiring for next year's class of video scouts again in just a few months' time. So look for that around April when we'll start gearing up for the 2022 season. But right now, at the end of the season, as we're wrapping things up here, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to all of the video scouts that have ever charted a game for SIS, and of course our hardworking ops staff, the people that oversee our video scouts and are auditing and ensuring just the highest level of data quality. We're forever in your debt for allowing us to do what we do.
Just as an example, one thing that they do is they watch every play of every game, as we've said, and they note who is on the field for every play. And that's the left guard and the 2 defensive tackles. And we're doing that off of video footage, and it's a complicated process, the time-consuming process. I know that I couldn't do it if I was asked to do it. It's very impressive.
That's not the complicated part of the process. That's the relatively straightforward part of the process. The fun part is the blocking schemes, the coverages, the intricacies of making sure that people can be on the same page, because football is a very complicated sport. And in order to boil that down into black and white, yes or no data points, there's a ton that goes into that.
So we're going to do the same thing for the NFC. Got a bunch of teams to go through here, and we start at the top with the Packers. Are they at the top of your list, Alex?
They're darn close. They end up being just a smidge behind the Bucks in sort of total, but obviously absolutely a qualified team to be where they are. Second in passing, eighth in running, fifth in pass defense, and 32nd in run defense. And, this is a team that's a perfect example of, if you're going to be bad at something, be bad at the thing that matters the least. And so, just sort of comparing the points above average values that are associated with those ranks, like the Packers are -2 points per game in run defense, and that puts them 32nd. And just being like eighth in run offense gets them 1.9 points, and being second in the passing game is 7.6 points, which is basically 3 times as valuable as their run defense is bad when they are the worst team in the NFL in running. So just keeping in mind sort of the scale of these things. But the team, in terms of like recency weighting, doesn't really affect this team. They've been about what they've been the entire year. And they've been pretty bad defending the run. We know that they've had 3 above average run defense games according to total points this year. I suppose you could say it's good news that they were all in the second half of the year, so maybe they're improving a bit. But from their perspective, it barely matters. They've been this bad pretty much all year, and they've gotten to this point.
The Packers are fascinating to me because they're a team that's really changed a lot from what they were last year. I think that offensively, the running game has really, with A.J. Dillon specifically, that's really taken another leap forward in terms of people being able to see throughout the entire year after week 1, I guess, what this offense was really capable of. And to the point where they've been able to do it despite not having their 2 best offensive linemen for more often than not this year. They've been able to overcome that, which has been amazing. On that side of the ball, where could they go wrong? It would be exactly in that same place. Like if for example, they're not healthy at offensive tackle and they have another run in with the Bucks like they did last year, I think that would be a similar area where you could see a weakness. But I think they've done a pretty good job of trying to build around that. And even at the time where they've been less healthy, they've been able to make it through that. On the defensive side of the ball, again, totally changed what they're doing defensively. And yet here we are at the end of the year. And the concern, I think, if you're a Packers fan, would be, oh, geez, are we going to play the Niners again and have them run us over? Like going back to that whole. So it's like the last 2 ways that your season ended are both kind of like the 2 biggest risks going forward. But at the end of the day, I think the Packers are really strong because they made that change at their defensive coordinator. And the fact of the matter is, without Bakhtiari and Jenkins for most of the year, they've been more than fine. And it doesn't appear that that's going to be the thing that holds them back this year. So you've got to love their chances.
You do wonder, and we'll talk about them in a little bit, like you do wonder if they did face a team like the Eagles, who have their own problems, but are obviously like they're a run forward. I would be curious to see that matchup.
And we're going to get to the Eagles in just a little bit. But first, the Bucks.
The Bucks are probably the team that is, fading as the season goes towards the end. They rank worse in all 4 of these dimensions than they would if we didn't weight recent games. Now, that said, when I say they rank worse, they rank 4th in passing, 6th in rushing, 7th in pass defense, 11th in run defense. So there's a little bit of like a, pump the brakes type thing, but they've obviously had a lot of weirdness going on with their players who are available or not available, and for what reasons they are available or not available. But this is a team that had excellent underlying metrics each of the last 2 years. Last year, they won the Super Bowl. You certainly can't count them out. You just need to sort of clump them more in with the other good teams in the conference than we would have said a month ago.
Yeah, they're still the number 1 team when you look at over the course of the entire season. But of course, within that, last in special teams, which we don't expect to be something that comes back to bite them, but you never know in a 1-game sample what could happen there. And then in terms of their individual skill positions, their receivers have actually been their worst kind of action group in terms of passing, rushing, receiving, blocking. The receivers have been the worst part of their offense this year. Now, obviously, Antonio Brown is going to remain gone. And when we talk about the fading, a lot of that fading happened while he was out of the lineup. It seems to me that Gronk becomes like absolutely vital for what they want to do, because when you start to take away these cheat codes from Brady, it hasn't been great, even though we could reel off 8 great receivers that they have on their roster.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds really familiar, the idea of a Tom Brady relying so much on Gronk being healthy. It sounds almost too familiar, I'm sure, for people in the New England area.
So there are 2 other teams. You mentioned that the Bucs are number 1 in overall entire season total points if we put all the different units together. There are 2 other NFC teams that are essentially 1 point of ranking behind the Bucs. So let's start with the Cardinals because they're right there with the Bucs, and they've had a strange end to their season as well. What do you have on them, Alex?
Yeah, this is another team where including recent games more heavily definitely does not help them. They end up 7th in the passing game, 22nd in the running game, 14th in pass defense, and 3rd in run defense. And the biggest thing to note there, I guess, part of it is that the passing game has been a little bit worse. We know that DeAndre Hopkins has been out. But to me, the biggest thing to note is the defensive drop-off. On the defensive side, it's, just using first and second half splits as a proxy, Arizona is allowing 0.2 of an expected point more per play than they were in the first half. In the first half of the year, they were causing more bust plays, more plays of -1 EPA or worse than they were allowing boom plays of 1 EPA or more. Only the Bills could have claimed that at the time. Not so much anymore. It's more like 8% more big plays allowed than big plays caused for themselves. So to me, that's the bigger thing to worry about. I think that the passing offense and the offense in general is probably going to be fine, but the pass defense, especially when you face some of these better passing offenses in the playoffs, could be a point of concern for them.
Yeah, I was really happy to see their defense this year. I think that was one of the big stories of this year is the Cardinals really having the top-ranked defense. We've known that they're like the most positionless defense in the league. They've had a lot of exciting athletes back there. It really came together for them this year. And when you watch them on the film too, they're scary to go against because you really never know where those pressures are coming from. There's different sorts of athletes flying at you from every direction. And Chandler Jones is, kind of where it all starts for them in terms of just having that one freak that can lead everybody. That's a huge concern, what you're saying there, Alex, that defense has regressed. We all know that with Kyler Murray being in and out of the lineup, the offense has kind of been a little bit of a staccato, stop and go sort of thing. With the defense kind of taking steps back, as well as the Kyler Murray, he could be somebody that can win a game on his own versus he could be somebody that can kind of be neutralized at different times, depending on his health and depending on how things are going. This to me feels like, I know there are a lot of people that like to call the Cardinals kind of the fake sharp team, Cliff Kingsbury, fake sharp. Our friend Adam Levitan will always say there. But I think that they're doing a lot of really interesting things. I think they're probably the team that reminds me the most of like the Michael Vick Atlanta Falcon teams that I remember from years ago, where it's like, this is the team that you would hate to play because you have no idea if they're going to do something that you just can't beat. You might show up at the stadium and Kyler Murray just beats you no matter what. But then at the same time, you kind of hate to be them because you don't know what's going to show up, even if you are the coach of the Cardinals. So very boom bust team here in terms of what their playoff chances look like.
And the Rams.
Yeah, so the Rams are very middle of the road, but slightly above. If we look just at like the points above average values that are associated with each of these 4 dimensions, they are at 2 points above average passing, 1 point above rushing, 1 point above in pass defense, 2 points above in run defense. And those ranks end up being, a little bit different. Obviously, being 2 points above in run defense puts them at a higher rank overall, but you can see where they're at. They're, solidly ever so slightly above average. And that's probably not exactly the thing that you think of when you think of the Rams, particularly on the offensive side. They haven't been quite as explosive in the pass game of late, although they've been pretty explosive overall. They had a 32% boom rate in the passing game through the first half of the year, 20% in the second half of the year, more sacks, more picks. So just like less going on from the passing game's perspective. On the whole, the fact that they are just sort of slightly above average in all of these dimensions is, it means that they are balanced and they're going to not necessarily beat themselves in any one dimension. We're talking about the teams that have big holes in one sense or another. They're going to be a bit of a counter to that. and not being too deficient in any particular aspect.
Yeah, I mean, this is a team that has some players that I love and then some things that really concern me about them. The left side of their offensive line, two of the top players by total points this year, Andrew Whitworth and David Edwards. Those guys have absolutely crushed it throughout the whole year. Aaron Donald would probably be my MVP vote if I was voting right now, just for the way that he's dominated his position in a way that I think goes beyond the way anybody else has dominated their position. I think there are a few pass rushers you could put in the category. I think Micah Parsons has a good case, but he's really the guy that when you look at where's the second ranked defensive tackle, it's Aaron Donald has 150% of his production. Jalen Ramsey, obviously on the back end of this team, I think is a strong player. So you have some of the strongest players in the league at various positions. And I think Matthew Stafford, I'm a big believer in Matthew Stafford. I think he's absolutely a win-with quarterback, despite everything that might be going on. But the loss of Robert Woods, we can't ignore that. When we're talking about a team that when their overall season stats are not the same as what these recency stats are, and these recency stats are showing a little bit of regression, and it coincides with this loss of Robert Woods, I think that his impact on that offense goes so far beyond what you see in terms of the stats that he creates as an individual. I think that's really made it difficult for them. The story of the postseason for me will be, can they figure out a way to sort of get to 100% full strength? Can Matthew Stafford look like the one that we saw when Woods was healthy? Can Cooper Kupp look like the Kupp that we saw when Woods was healthy? Or is this going to be a little bit more of that sort of struggle city? I love this team as a contender because of some of those players that we just mentioned. That's the question mark for me right there.
Rams are a game better than the Cardinals in the NFC West heading into the final week, but they're even overall in the total points rankings. And then lastly, among division leaders, what about the Cowboys?
Yeah, so this team is if we're talking about the Rams being sort of even keel, the Cowboys are not one of those teams. They're 14th ranked in the passing game, 24th in the running game, first in pass defense, and 15th in run defense. Matt was just talking about Micah Parsons. It's not just him, it's a bunch of guys. And we've also talked a fair amount about Trayvon Diggs. He certainly had an exciting start to the year, but even then was masking some pretty questionable results in the rest of his snaps. You know, in the second half of the year, he's had 4 picks, but has allowed 11 yards per target. So it's hard to guess what's going to happen with him from game to game. He could absolutely win the game for you and could absolutely lose the game for you. While that's been happening, cornerbacks Anthony Brown and Jordan Lewis have been a lot more productive overall than Diggs. And even Parsons has started to show, you know, we talked earlier in the year about how he was a much more flexible player coming out of college than what he was originally showing. And they were having him focus more on the pass rushing. And now he's started to show his ability to do it all. He's allowed 6 yards in the passing game on 137 coverage snaps in the second half of the year. So there's a lot of guys contributing in the pass defense game. And the offense just hasn't been, you know, it's been fine. It's had its moments, but it has certainly not been as explosive and exciting as we were sort of given the impression either before the year or sort of at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, I love that you bring up some of the guys. You beat me to it in terms of the corners, specifically Anthony Brown, who's third in the NFL in total points amongst corners right now. It's pretty interesting that everybody wants to talk about Trayvon Diggs. Part of the reason why he's getting all those targets, even though he's getting the interceptions, is because the other guys in their secondary are pretty good. Micah Parsons, like you mentioned, he's been phenomenal. I think that this team is really scary when you have both Randy Gregory and DeMarcus Lawrence on the edges, and you have Micah Parsons coming up through an A gap or something like that. All of a sudden, you just don't have enough answers for all of the pass rushers that they bring at you. Meanwhile, this is a team that perennially, we love what they do on the offensive line. They're one of the best built offensive lines in the league. But the offense has really, really struggled. Obviously, while Dak was out and with kind of since then over the remaining course of the year, I don't know. I don't know what's going on in terms of can they get back on track in that regard? Because like you mentioned, that it's something that we kind of expect. We expected more out of this offense. And certainly as they built their lead in the division, we saw more, but it's been rocky since then. So sort of another case of like, you know, which Cowboys offense are we going to get?
But this is absolutely the kind of team that can spike 3-4 week performance in the playoffs and have awesome passing performances, big disruptive plays from the pass rushers and from the defensive backs, and could find themselves in the Super Bowl.
The overall number 8 team in total points is the 49ers, who we haven't brought up yet. We brought up a lot of teams before we brought them up, but here they are, as I said, at number 8. Where do they rank when we factor in recency?
Yeah, so in theory, they're in the mold of like a run and stop the run team. And they are a top run defense from this metric. They are the number 1 run defense. But in practice, their passing game has actually been a bit better, and especially when we include recency. 8th ranked passing offense, 16th ranked rush offense, 24th in pass defense, and as I mentioned, number 1 in run defense. And I think when you think of an offense that has, we know that they've had a rotating cast of characters in the backfield, and so we can sort of give them a pass there. But the on the passing side of things, they've been a lot more explosive than you'd expect, especially if you knew that it was Jimmy G being the quarterback the whole time and not Trey Lance. Both of them had relatively similar performances in terms of that boom rate, but they, over the course of the entire year, they trail only the Rams in boom percentage through the air, which I think would surprise a lot of people. And if we were doing sort of watchable parts of matchups going forward, they play the Rams this weekend, that would be the most watchable thing for me. This is the matchup between the two teams that get big plays from an EPA perspective the most often.
So I do want to go with that, what you said about how the Rams are first in boom passing and the 49ers are second. You and I had a brief back and forth about this earlier this week, that Jimmy G is ranked where he is, but 49ers pass catchers are like way up there. Can you just explain that?
Yeah, I mean, so part of it is that they have kinds of skill position players. Deebo Samuel, we know, is a monster after the catch. And obviously that does not, all the stuff that he's been doing where he's been getting carries out of the backfield and stuff, as a receiver, he gets those points. So if you were categorizing things that way, that's true. But what you're talking about, Mark, is receiving as a pass catcher. And even then, he's getting a lot of production after the catch. George Kittle has had a monster second half of the year after kind of disappearing in the first half. And we know that he's also a yards after the catch guy. So definitely, I mean, and these are not, these are not breakout players. These are players that we knew had these skill sets and had been productive for this team before, but they've just sort of figured out how to make them work in a better way than they were at the beginning of the year.
So that's cool that you normally just have a passer's yardage and a receiver's yardage, but we can essentially, with this system, divvy up the credit such that the receivers are getting much more of the credit in this case, right?
Yeah, that's a big thing that we want to be a calling card of a total point system.
That's cool.
It's not even just that we're saying on a 40-yard pass, the 40 yards go to both the quarterback and the receiver. It's that if it was a 40-yard pass and there were 12 air yards and 28 yards after the catch, like, it's not even just split on that perspective. We also have an understanding of how likely were yards after the catch on that play. And given the accuracy of the pass, that changes expectations, stuff like that. So we want to add these layers in where it's not just saying, this is the amount of air yards, this is how we're splitting it, but it's also what are the expectations of those plays.
I feel like it's good that we bring that up because those are standout things for us.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think you guys are spot on when you talk about some of the reasons why the Niners are really good. For me, when I look at this from a scouting perspective, they're like a classic build inside out type team, the way they're built this year. Yes, they have Kittle doing stuff. Yes, they have Deebo Samuel doing stuff, but really at their core, this is a team that's dominating on the line of scrimmage. You said those guys aren't new players coming around. How about two players that are really not new players coming around? Trent Williams, third among offensive tackles in total points, and Alex Mack, fourth amongst centers in total points, players that have been doing it forever, but are, I think, really key components of what actually makes the Niners work in that Shanahan offense. It's dominate up front with what they like to do from a running scheme perspective, and then marrying all the different parts around that, and then setting up spots where you get Deebo Samuel the ball in space, and yeah, he can do damage after the catch. So I think they're built really interestingly. It's surprising when you really take a step back to think how fast they've risen up the ranks. It makes you think they might be a real contender, but then you go and take another step back and you say, like, do I really think that either of these quarterbacks, whoever's playing for them, is going to beat Brady, Rodgers, etc.?
Tall order for sure. All right, let's close out this topic and essentially close out the show with the Eagles.
Let's talk about those birds. It's a passing league, and this is a team that's going to definitely not do as much passing as they're going to do running in terms of the focus of the offense. Although that said, and Jalen Hurts has had an up and down year, but in terms of the overall production of the passing game, they're 10th in terms of the recency weighted points above average, 3rd in the running game, 19th in pass defense, and 20th in run defense. You can see that the defense, even though they've looked pretty good from a raw numbers perspective in recent weeks, not so much from a points above average perspective. And it's worth noting that is not opponent adjusted in any way, but this is a team that played in their last 5 weeks, both New York teams and Washington. Those are the only teams that they've played in the last 5 weeks. So the defense has looked pretty good, but the offenses they've faced have been questionable at best. Darius Slay had a nice resurgent season going in the middle of the year, but he's produced literally 0 points saved each of the last 4 weeks. So the game against Dallas this week would have theoretically been a test for this defense after facing a pretty cupcake schedule, but we don't really know what the incentives will be for either of those teams in that game. So I'll be curious to see what either of those teams show, but I'm most curious to see how a team like the Eagles plays against, if we see them go up against some of these teams that would struggle in the run defense game.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the Eagles are, sorry, Alex, not a contender. They're fun. I like rooting for them. I think that they've done some really cool stuff. Goddard's had a good year for them. Devontae Smith, I think, is the truth. There's some fun things to like about the way that the Eagles play, especially on the offensive line. So I enjoy them for that reason, but I don't think this is a real contender when we're talking about winning a Super Bowl this year.
I will drown my sorrows in a Wawa hoagie.
All right. So I think a number of cool takeaways from this discussion. Thanks, Alex, for crafting that. Thanks, Matt, as well, for Matt Minicherian and Alex Figerman, and our producer, Justin Stein. I'm Mark Simon. Thank you for listening to the Off the Charts Football Podcast.